All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining. Welcome to the first Wine Intelligence webinar in 2021, focusing on wine consumer trends in the US market. This webinar is part of our Wine Consumer Observatories we're running throughout the year. So just to start us off with some introductions, my name is Courtney Abernathy, and I'm the Communications and Report Shop Manager at Wine Intelligence. I handle all things comms and PR related, including our weekly newsletter. Most of you will probably recognize my names from the emails you receive from Wine Intelligence. I also manage the Report Shop online. So if you have any questions regarding reports or your Wine Intelligence All Access or Observatory account, please reach out to me directly. I can also set anyone up who may not have access yet. Before I introduce Lily and Luis, I'll just run through a bit of housekeeping first. First, this webinar is being recorded and will be available through your Wine Intelligence account in a few days, along with a PDF copy of the presentation. We'll also send you a direct link when both are ready. And then secondly, for the best view of the webinar, I recommend you select side-by-side gallery view, which I believe is the third option in your view option, so that you can see the sources at the bottom of each slide. Great. So today on the webinar, we have Luli, who's the CEO of Wine Intelligence. She'll be presenting the majority of the material today. We also have Luis Osorio, who's a senior manager here at Wine Intelligence. Luis, do you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Yeah, thanks, Courtney. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. I'm Luis Osorio. I look over clients in some markets, including the US, particularly in the East Coast. Today, I'll be supporting Luli by moderating the Q&A, which is a function can be found on the bottom of your screen, and you can use to type your questions anytime during the session. I'll be answering live. I will also let Luli know in case there is any need for further clarification on specific slides for her. So just type, and if I feel like I need Luli's help, I will kindly interrupt you, Luli. Everyone will also have opportunity to ask questions in the end. So with this, I think that's all. Back to you, Courtney.
So before Luli takes the reins, just a quick overview of what we'll be talking about today. We're going to be going through 6 key wine consumer trends in the US market, including the emergence of a new consumer segment, Generation Treaters. All of what we're discussing comes from these 3 reports, Wine Consumer Trends in the COVID-19 Era, US Wine Landscapes 2021, and US Portraits 2021, all of which are available in your All Access or Observatory account. When we send out the PDF copy of the presentation, we'll also include which report each slide comes from, so you know where to look for future information. And without further ado, over to you, Luli.
Thank you very much, Courtney. My pleasure to be here, and thank you everyone for taking some time out of your busy days to join us to focus on the US market. As Courtney was saying there, the first of our 2021 webinars from Wine Intelligence. So we're talking about consumer behavior. We're talking about the 6 key trends that we are seeing and observing from all of our research in the US, one of our key markets at Wine Intelligence. And it's in the context of consumer trends. So I thought it reminded me to take a step backwards before moving forwards to look at the trends and just remind myself that we are human beings, as we know, and we're talking about consumers and how we behave in this context of us being human beings. And there's a few key kind of lessons from the consumer behavior world and the consumer behavior theory that we can build on here. And the first one is that habits are called habits for a reason. And when I looked at the definition, dictionary definition of habits, it says settled or regular tendency or practice, hard to give up. And as consumers, as human beings, what we tend to move towards is this habitual behavior. So breaking habits is quite a hard thing for us to do. And particularly in our category, the wine category, which has such longevity and such a great history, actually habits take quite a long time to change. Habits of what we're drinking, how we're drinking, and why we're drinking. And I think what's particularly fascinating about what we saw in 2020 and we're now seeing in 2021, US market especially, is that there's been an acceleration in those change of habits, and that's what we're going to focus on. Three other things just to kind of bear in mind as to why we're seeing some of these evolutions in terms of consumer behavior. First is, as human beings, again, we tend to take the path of least resistance. Typically, we are actually quite lazy people, and we tend to say, kind of, what's the easiest route? What do I know? What's familiar? What's an easy buy? That's why recommendations work. Somebody's told me it's good, therefore it's a good idea. I have to use less of my brain energy and thoughts and power to make that decision as to which wine I'm choosing, which for most people, quite frankly, nice to have, but not necessarily that important a decision in their lives. We also tend to be quite risk averse. Yes, we like experimentation, we like new experiences, but culturally, most of us are actually programmed to be quite risk averse. It's how we protect ourselves as a species. And we also tend to think quite narrowly in terms of our own horizons. So yes, we talk about kind of diversity and outward looking, but actually in our day-to-day lives, we tend to have a more narrow path in terms of how we're experiencing. And all of these have impacted these 6 trends that we're seeing. So if we move on to the next slide, Courtney's navigating the slides for me here as we go. Let's just give ourselves 2 bits of context about wine drinkers in the US market. First of which, in the last 5 years, so if you look down to the bottom of this slide, you'll see that in 2015, we had 88 million regular, that means drink wine at least once a month, wine drinkers in the US. 5 years on, so back to the tail end of 2020, we now see that we have 77 million regular wine drinkers. We've lost, in quotes, regular wine drinkers in the US market. Now, what's interesting is if you go up to the 2 figures above that, back in 2015, we had 110 million wine drinkers. So that's people who drink wine at least once a year. And that's increased to 118 million. So overall, there's been an increase. That's primarily been driven by the change in demographics in the US, a growing adult population. So that's been one of the main reasons that we've seen that. But actually, there has been this shift, and we've gone from 37% of adults of the legal drinking age in the US drinking wine at least once a month back in 2015, up to in 2020, that's 32%, so a third. So we've gone down a little bit, and you might say, well, how come we've seen this kind of steady increase in terms of volume and value over time? We'll come into this because that's to do with frequency and weight of consumption as opposed to the total number of drinkers. So if we move to the next slide, Courtney, we can also see that there's a real focus, not surprisingly, in terms of where our wine drinkers in the US are located. We see this in all markets, the kind of urban centres, the metropolitan areas, the big centres typically is where we see, not surprisingly, a higher incidence of wine drinkers. But if we look specifically in the US market, over a fifth, so 22% of regular wine drinkers reside in just 5 key metropolitan areas in the US. And you can see on the chart here, those 5 areas listed out, starting off with New York, Newark, metropolitan area, Los Angeles, Long Beach, Dallas, Fort Worth, Chicago, Nashville, and then San Jose, San Francisco, Oakland corridor, metropolitan area. So we have quite a concentration, not surprisingly. We often, you tell from my English accent, an outsider to the US in that sense, we often think about the US market in terms of it's very big and there's people everywhere. And actually, like most markets, not surprisingly, there are concentrations. If we just dial down, for example, to the top 10 metropolitan areas for wine drinkers in the US, we see that those top 10 markets, actually, that's a third of wine drinkers are just in those top 10 metropolitan areas. So not surprisingly, we have this sort of metropolitan focus in terms of where our drinkers are. That doesn't clearly mean our other markets aren't opportunities, but just that little bit of context in terms of where our drinkers are. So let's hit those trends, having thought about consumers on the next slide now, and having thought about where our drinkers are. So number one, first trend we're seeing, again at a more macro level, but amongst wine drinkers, consumers are increasingly cautious in their lifestyles. So what does that mean? So if we move on to the next slide, one of the projects we undertook sort of unexpectedly in 2020 was a COVID tracker, and Courtney referred you to that, and that you'll see in your report shop or observatory all access. So we collected data back in March, April of 2020, and then again in July, August, and actually we're now currently, as I speak, in the middle of the next wave of that data collection. What we're trying to do is to monitor and measure how consumers are behaving with wine, the data that you're seeing here, but also how they're feeling, their kind of outlook on life in general. How are they anticipating returning as there's availability and as markets open up, as opportunities open up for us to travel more, to be out in the on-premise more? How are we feeling about that? So we put lots of variables into a segmentation model, as is a want for a research company like ours. And we looked at wine consumers in terms of lots of factors. We asked them lots of questions about how do they feel, you know, when, and we used specifically the question when the dangers or the current dangers of the pandemic have passed and opportunity to be out and about more is available. Now, clearly, we had to leave that question kind of relatively open because none of us, you know exactly when that's going to be. But this gives us a measure of consumer sentiment. And we find that amongst regular wine drinkers, 17% are what we classify as hedonists. They anticipate increasing their social and lifestyle activities post-pandemic. Not surprisingly, these wine drinkers tend to be actually at the more heavier end of wine involvement, wine spend, and wine drinkers. So the kind of good news story for us in the category is that our heavier, more involved, higher spending, higher volume drinkers are the ones that are actually kind of moving towards this concept, I guess many of us have been hearing, reading, talking about the return of the roaring 20s. Whether that be end of this year, next year, or the year after, in a much more hedonistic lifestyle. Well, the kind of positive news in our category is that it's our wine drinker community who are saying, yes, that's where I want to go. We then have nearly half, so 45% of regular wine drinkers in the US we classify as moderators. They're talking about a few lifestyle changes anticipated, maybe socializing, taking the habit, as I was talking about earlier, of drinking more at home rather than more in the on-premise, maybe adopting more of the takeout curbside activities that the on-premise has been adopting and wineries have been adopting. So some moderation in behavior, but overall anticipating returning to pretty similar behavior. We then have 16% of regular wine drinkers who are reducers. They say they are going to significantly curtail their lifestyle, their social lives post-pandemic. They're really thinking about reducing back. They're not comfortable even, for example, with attending large-scale sporting events, even things like outdoor festivals and events. It's really avoiding the crowds, avoiding planes, avoiding hotels, avoiding overseas travel, very much centered around their sort of local area. And then finally, we have the 22% at the bottom. These are what we call halters. These are people who are saying, actually, I am going to really cease the lifestyle activities that I used to have pre-pandemic. Now, interestingly, our hedonists typically are those that have had most either personal or household impact from the virus themselves. And interestingly, they tend to be the ones counterintuitively that have had the most financial impact. That's partly related to life stage, where we know that Gen Z and millennials, typically younger workers, have been more impacted financially, given the nature of the type of industries, hospitality, tourism, retail, that they tend to work in. So that's our segmentation, but I promised you we'd be talking about trends. So what's happened? And if we look at the next slide, what we can see is the difference between when we measured this in April 2020 versus then again when we measured in August 2020 is big shifts. We see the same number of hedonists, so that's good for wine. They're still out there, they're still anticipating more broad behavior in the future. However, this near half of wine consumers who've fitted into this moderator category, that's really shrunk. And we've seen an increase in the proportion of wine drinkers that fell or now fall into both the reducer and the halter category. So as we transition through 2020, the level of pessimism in terms of what I think I'm going to be doing, anticipating my lifestyle, my social life in the future has reduced. We will, as I said, be measuring that. We are collecting data now in our next Vinatrack data collection wave in January, so live in field at the moment. So we'll be able to update you all on, is that trend happening? But if I give you a little bit of context here, we measure these segments in multiple markets of the 36 markets that we work in Wine Intelligence. And actually the patterns are really consistent globally. This is not a unique pattern to the US, that there's more pessimism, there's less anticipation of these social and lifestyle activities. We're seeing this in all markets, not surprisingly, particularly coming through in some of the European markets. So if we move on to the next slide, please, Courtney. So trend number 2. Wine, so in that context, wine has been a beneficiary of 2020 despite the lockdowns. So again, some good news stories for us in our category, particularly in the US market, in terms of what we're seeing against what we may have anticipated to be seeing if we think back to kind of February, March, April and May last year. So if we move on to the next slide, I believe that my new colleague, Brandy Rand, who is COO for Americas for IWSR, now that Wine Intelligence and IWSR announced 10 days ago or so that we are now joining forces as two businesses. So I'm really delighted that Brandy's joining this call, and I know that her team and her data will be a valuable source to combine with Wine Intelligence data for all of our clients going forward. But I did take just this piece of insight from a project actually that we have been doing, an ongoing project that we've been collaborating with Brandy, the team at IWSR, which is looking at trends in total beverage alcohol. Obviously, IWSR specialise in total beverage alcohol, and we've been able to monitor alongside the Wine Intelligence COVID tracker insight actually what's happening at a beverage alcohol level. And what we can see, so we look at those those blue circles or blue bubbles that we're seeing on that chart. And this is representative amongst all beverage alcohol consumers in the US. And as I said, this is part of a 3-wave study that we've done. We're just about to publish wave 2 in February with IWSR, and the 3rd wave we'll be collecting in the summer in the US market. So if you do have further questions on that study, then please get in touch with myself or Brandy on that. But what is it telling us if we're looking at all beverage alcohol? Well, as I said, those blue lines, they show us that there's a net change, positive change in consumption. So if I just interpret that a little bit, so drinking more. Drinking more means a combination of drinking both more frequently, but also it might also include drinking more volume at those occasions. So by more here, we mean a combination of increase in volume for occasion, but also increase in frequency of occasion. So you'll see that wine over this period during 2020, so this data was collected in December and it's the data that we'll be publishing at the end of February. So this is a sneak preview. It's collected in December. So it's telling us that consumers are drinking more wine. And if we compare that, for example, to hard seltzer, we all know a category that's continued on its steep growth trajectory in the US market. We can see that that's up by 21% in terms of this net change in consumption volume and value. And I just pulled out another couple of categories to sort of compare it to bev alc categories. So if we look at Tennessee whiskey, that's up, for example, 17% in terms of net consumption. Beer up 9% and vodka up 7%. If you look at the red numbers at the bottom there, this is the net change in spend. So this is again US, this is representative of all beverage alcohol drinkers in the US. And what they're telling us is that actually in terms of wine, well, the net spend is going up 10%. So it's tracking slightly below the volume. So that means people are slightly decreasing their typical spend per unit in wine. Hard seltzer, really interesting one. Obviously, the volume has gone up significantly, or the net increase, but actually the spend levels are pretty much stable. Tennessee whiskey, a bit like wine, the volume's gone up and the net spend has, so as we know in the whiskey categories generally, will kind of move towards premiumization in terms of whiskey. And again, in beer, typically the spend has remained pretty constant, even though there's been a volume increase. And again, we see a little bit of an over increase from vodka, which is the, again, linked to this premiumization of the spirits categories during this period. And just to note, that's the net change per unit or per serve, not the overall spend. So that's the proportion there. So it's been really interesting to see that wine is one of the categories that has held out the most alongside some of the spirits, particularly the premium spirits, and this ongoing growth in terms of hard seltzer. So if we look at the next slide, we can kind of break that down more to wine in terms of seeing specifically where this opportunity or growth in wine is coming from. So a very complex chart. I'll talk you through what we're looking at here. So what we're looking at here is, and again, I've put it in context of various markets that we measure so we can see the relative trends in the US versus what we see in other markets. And what we're doing is we're going back to March 2019 from this data up to October 2020. So about a year and a half, sort of pushing on to 2 years in terms of, and this is the average or the mean frequency of wine consumption. So how often, on average, do regular US wine drinkers drink wine in a combination of on and off premise? So overall, we can see the mean number of occasions, average number of occasions. And what we can see pretty much with those lines going across back from March 2019, and then we measured it again in March 2020, but we were asking consumers about their pre-pandemic behavior at that point. And then as we're kind of going into more of the impact of pandemic in April 2020, August 2020, and October 2020. And what we saw in a number of key markets, so in Canada, in the US, and in the UK, is this real peak happening in our Northern Hemisphere summer. So a real peak as actually over that time, the mean frequency, the average frequency of wine drinking was increasing. We saw that interestingly on the slide before in the IWSR data at the total bev alcohol, and we see it in the wine specific data as well. If we think about August, that was a net increase of frequency. So the net increase in terms of the number of times people are drinking wine of 19% peak in August. And that dropped down to in October to still a plus 6% increase versus 2019. So overall, we ended the year at a net increase in wine consumption frequency, even though there's a lot of on-premise restrictions. You know, even the on-premise was open, it might have been reduced on-premise at 50% capacity, for example, depending on which state and which county, which region we're talking about in the US. If we compare that to other markets, we're seeing some similar increases in others. Some markets like Canada and China, if we look at the overall trend, actually no change, so no positive or negative increase in frequency, but the wine category holding up. So if we take these markets as sort of key examples of more established and international markets, there we can see what the key trends are there. And as I'm speaking, I can see a really good questions come in terms of, given that US surveys are typically based on 700 to 2,000 consumers, as far as I know. I think it's Michael is asking, and considering there are around 100 million wine drinkers in the US, how confident are you in your survey results? Fantastic question. Again, we'll send you some kind of details on, if you're interested, on confidence levels and how we calculate them. Typically, our surveys in the US from Wine Intelligence are based on an N of 2,000. So that, from a margin of error perspective, given that you're quite right in terms of how we're talking, that gives us a confidence level that we're looking at this 3 to 5% confidence level. But again, we can kind of give you some of the more technical details, and maybe Juan, our research director, who also looks after our South American markets, can come on to that one. But that's how we calculate it, and that's why typically for the Wine Intelligence surveys we move to an N of 2,000 as opposed to 1,000 in the US market. Whereas in other markets, smaller markets like Sweden, for example, will be working on a sample size of 1,000. But also, just on that one, we also use quota sampling. So we're using quota sampling, which means we do other surveys to find out what the shape of wine drinkers looks like in terms of the proportion of men, women, age, socioeconomics and geography within a market, within a country. And we use that quota sampling to ensure that we're truly representative of wine drinkers in that market, or in case of the slide I showed you previously from IWSR, that we're truly representative of all alc bev drinkers in that market. So I hope that answers the question, but we'll add a slide in at the end when we send this out to you all, and then you can see the kind of confidence intervals that we're working at. Perfect. So if we just move on to the next slide then, Courtney. I don't know what it's been like in all of your households over the last year or so, but one I'm personally rather familiar with, which is the extension of wine o'clock. And what do we mean by this? Well, this is here where we're talking about wine broadening the occasion usage. And again, really good news for us in the wine category here, because what we're seeing in the US market is this expansion of the typical categories at which wine is consumed. So what we have found from the research that we're doing, if we just go on to the next slide, Courtney, is that, so I'll talk you through the data and then I'll tell you some of the reasons that consumers are telling us this. So if we look at this slide, we were asking consumers, are you drinking more often, so above the grey line, or less often, below the grey line, than you did pre-pandemic? And we take two at-home occasions, just as an example here. So on the left, we've got a relaxing drink at the end of the day at home. And on the right, we've got an informal meal at home. So we've got those two different occasions. And what we can see, if you look on the left-hand side, so the kind of goldy yellow arrows for the US, and you can see that back in April, which is the dotted line, the first line that you can see there, back in April, there was an increase in consumers drinking more often for a relaxing drink at the end of the day at home. And that by August had increased even more. See that pattern in other markets. In the US, we've also seen some increase by August with an informal meal, but not to the same extent that we're seeing those non-food occasions. So what's been really happening, and we're hearing from consumers when we conduct all of our qualitative interview research, is actually they're saying to us, that opening a bottle of wine was, prior to being at home much more, actually a little bit of a barrier. The idea being, well, do I really want to open the bottle? You know, am I going to finish it? So it's easier to grab a beer, to grab a hard seltzer, to grab that kind of single serve unit. And what we've heard from consumers through 2020 is actually them saying, well, you know, if I'm going to open a bottle of wine, if I, you know, I'll open it tonight. If I don't finish it, it's fine, because I'm still going to be here tomorrow and the next day and the next day. So there's been a real kind of psychological change in terms of that unit and that serve size. And also consumers typically might have consumed, for example, mixed drinks, cocktails, beer, craft beer, particularly as we know, more when in the on-premise, you know, choosing different drinks to those that they were with. Now what they're saying is, well, actually, I'm at home with my housemates, my flatmates, whoever it happens to be, my partner. So actually, it's more kind of sociable and conducive to share a bottle of wine, and particularly for those non-food occasions when wine might not necessarily have been the first choice. If we look at the next slide, there was another phenomena that we observed, which is back. So the first circle, the clear circle that you see there, is the April number, and then the solid circle there is the August number. You can see that quite a lot of us around the world migrated back in kind of April, May time, sort of March, April, May time, to indulging and enjoying maybe a glass of wine or two, maybe at lunchtime at home. And what we saw is that kind of initial lockdown day drinking of wine actually kind of dropping down and sort of going back to more pre-pandemic levels. So I think there was that sort of novelty, fear of being at home, of what was happening to us. And we did see that kind of peak. Now, as I'm talking, as I was trying to recall the confidence levels there for the question we had earlier, I just saw one of my colleagues, Richard, posting to me the answer. So maybe, Richard, you can just ping that to Luis and he can put it up on the Q&A, or you could put it up on the Q&A for us. Because I was just trying to recall off the top of my head, I think it's 3% at 95% confidence interval for the N of 2000, but he will just clarify that to make sure I haven't misremembered that detail. And as Richard or Luis is typing that in as well, we can move to the next trend. So there's been a shift towards localism that we've seen in the US market. And that shift towards localism, again, if we move to the next slide, we'll just remind ourselves, if you'll forgive me to take us all back to something I'm sure we're all familiar with, but I was reminded of this, thinking about why is this shift to localism happening? And it's not just happening in wine, it's not just happening in beverage alcohol, it's happening in a multitude of categories. And we're seeing it across multiple markets, not just in the US. And what has happened when we're in times of kind of panic, fear, pressure, crisis, you know, all of those things, which we've seen lots of in the US as well as everywhere else in 2020, we tend to retreat from the higher order in terms of Maslow, you know, what's kind of occupying us and what are we trying to do, the self-actualization, how do I look to others? How do I appear? How's my personal growth going? How am I fulfilled? These kind of higher order motivations, the esteem, you know, how do I look to others? How do I get achievement? How do I get respect? When we're in those moments that are much more kind of feral in terms of how we're feeling, the pressure that we're feeling under, the fear and the panic, we kind of revert back down to the sort of lower order levels. So things like, you know, love and belonging, safety needs, you know, just kind of basic and fundamental security and safety. How do I ensure that? And physiological needs. And this partly explains why we're seeing what we are in the wine category, because that is a kind of a function of what we're seeing in localism. So if we move on to the next slide, it kind of plays out really well in the data we've been collecting and explains what we see here. What we see here is, we're asking consumers, so we've got our grey line across the middle here, and we're asking consumers, are you doing more or less of these things during 2020? And you'll see that, you know, wine's up a little bit, champagne, not surprisingly, down, more associated with social, larger scale events, celebrations, we all know that. But you'll see the bottled water ping straight up. And again, this is US data, this is not an exclusive trend that we saw in the US. You know, for most of us in many of the kind of key wine markets that we're working in, turning a tap and tap water or filtered water, you know, from our taps is perfectly good. Or even if we were buying bottled water before, suddenly we all went out and bought a lot more bottled water. And that's this idea of safety, of reassurance, of kind of where stockpiling comes from. Why do we do stockpiling behavior? Because we're reverting back down to those safety needs, those physiological needs, the kind of more inbred, instinctive, animal instinctive. And that impacts all categories, even up to one like ours in wine. So if we look at the next slide, we can see this panning out in terms of country of origin. So we ask consumers, are you actively buying more or less of wine from these countries? And this was in August, compared with your pre-pandemic behavior. And what you can see on the left-hand side, so the green arrow is I'm doing more, the red arrow below our sort of no change grey line is I'm doing less. And then those numbers that you see, so for example, above the California line, where it says plus 17, that's the net change score. So this net change score for Californian wine is 17%, US wine overall plus 8%, and that's amongst US regular drinkers. You'll then see there's a negative net change, so a decrease score for all other key New World and Old World countries of origin. When we measured this in the US back in April, actually these numbers were even lower for the import, and they've come back up a little bit. But it's still this idea that I'm kind of feeling, this is how, and when we've been interviewing them in November and December, we ran a big qualitative interview program with consumers. And what we're hearing from them is saying, well, actually, you know, I've kind of engaged more with my local wineries. You know, I might even have been able to visit them if I wasn't able to do other activities. And also, there are other drivers as to why we're seeing this in the US. Some of it is about distribution and planogram or store layout. It's about the strength of the domestic brands. So we know that shoppers are telling us, again, not just in wine, but in all categories, shoppers are telling us, you know, I'm doing fewer shopping trips. I'm spending less dwell time in store choosing, and I'm switching more to online, which we all know about DTC and online. So a result of that is also that you tend to find or get more of the big brands, which in the case, obviously, of the market we're focusing on today, US market, tend to be domestic brands. So that's partly driving it. And then also we have to factor in tariffs and the impact of tariffs from certain countries and how that's played out in the market. But again, I could show you this similar slide amongst Australian regular wine drinkers, Canadian regular wine drinkers, even Chinese regular wine drinkers. And you'll see the same pattern in all markets where all consumers are turning more towards localism and being more engaged with their local brands and products. So if we move on to the next slide, so we're on number 5 of 6 of the trends we're seeing in the market. There's a simplifying, we're seeing in the US market, a very clear simplification of engagement with what I call, or what we call, the traditions of wine. And when we're thinking about the traditions of wine, that's about terroir, that's about varietal and detailed varietal knowledge, that's about understanding vinification, that's about understanding production and you know, the barrels and and all of this kind of, sort of history and authenticity, the beauty of what we have in the wine category. And actually what we're seeing amongst US consumers is an ongoing trend. So this isn't just a trend that we saw in 2020. It hasn't suddenly emerged. It was a trend that we were already seeing anyway. And what we've seen is this trend has been accelerated in 2020. So if we look at the next slide, we can look at how, as an example of this, how consumers are choosing wine. And if you look here, we see lots and lots of blue arrows going down, and that means that statistically significant decrease in terms of consumers relying on or using these choice cues when they're buying and choosing wine. So what we see is every one of the choice cues dropping back. And that means that actually consumers are relying less on this broad range of choice cues than they had been doing. And when we talk to consumers, why is this? One of which is that we know, and they tell us, they're relying more on brand cues, so the individual brand cues, rather than the more traditional wine cues of terroir or varietal. And they're actually thinking about wine more from a brand product perspective than they had done previously. And I'll talk about that in the last trend in a moment. And other reasons that are driving that is, if we talk, borrow some of the learnings from the neuroscientists, we can talk about cognitive offloading. So this idea that we're just retaining less information because we have it at the touch of an iPhone, other devices are available, but at the touch of a button. So we're remembering less, so we can look up more. So we don't have to carry around this kind of wine encyclopedia of knowledge that we had previously because we have it at the touch of a button. So consumers are just relying less. And as another factor that we should also take into account, shift to online purchasing, where the information is embedded into that purchase decision. So we can see that if we want to, the taste descriptions, the style descriptions, the varietals, everything else about the wine at that point of purchase. So again, we're just not retaining that level of information as consumers in the US about wine compared with previous generations or the first generations of those that really embraced wine in the sense that we know it today. So if we look at the next slide, there's some interesting dynamics in the US market. The first is, despite this kind of reduction in reliance on choice cues, wine consumers are maintaining their confidence in terms of navigating the category, so they're not less confident. And they also, we can see there's been a significant decrease. So you can see that on the bottom bubble of that chart there, significant decrease in terms of their wine knowledge. So that means wine knowledge is really about breadth of wine knowledge. So how many varietals, countries, regions, brands, etc. do they know? So in line with this real shift in terms of what we're seeing in how consumers in the US are behaving with wine, and amongst that, this breadth of wine knowledge is decreasing. Counterintuitively, involvement is increasing. So this is not dumbing down. Let's not kind of take this, consumers don't care, it's dumbing down. It's just a shift in terms of the fundamental relationship with the category. Consumers are more involved than they used to be. They've got equal confidence. It's just this shifting breadth of knowledge as we're relating to the category in a different way. So if we look at the next slide, I think we're just going to ping over thank you, Courtney. You can see this breadth of knowledge really decreasing. So if we take the top 10 brands as an example, wine brands, and the top 10 countries of origin in the US market, you can see again, lots of blue arrows here. And what this means is that the breadth of brands that consume and origins that consumers are aware of has been decreasing. As I said, this was a trend we've been spotting, seeing, viewing in the market for a number of years, but has been kind of accelerating, particularly in terms of brands during 2020. I was going to do a quick question on the next slide, but I'm conscious of time and making sure that we left. So we won't run the poll, Courtney, but I will just get you to think about it here, which is that we can see now, we talked a lot, we've been talking for many years, myself and many others, I'm sure many of you in your businesses, about millennial consumers. And we're seeing that they are now part of what is driving the shift I was just talking about in terms of the relationship with the wine category in the US market. So if we look at the next slide, we can see, so if we go to the left-hand side here, we can see this was back in October 2019, and over to the right-hand side is October 2020. So it's a year view. And again, you see this real peak in August. You know, summertime really was summertime for most of us consuming in the wine market. Now, we do expect some peaks in the summer, but not as much as we saw in 2020. And you'll see that going into 2020, boomers and seniors were the most frequent wine drinkers, average of 9.6 wine drinking occasions across on and off premise. But through the year, we now see that actually the most frequent wine consumers in the US but they are millennials. And interestingly, we had this quite significant drop off in Gen Z towards the end of October. Some of the factors we hear, in fact, one of the clients who might be on the call, I hope it's okay to share, we were having a little riff here about why this might be. Maybe students or Gen Zs who had been at home, so consuming wine, more multi-generational in the family household, maybe more returning to college. Also, I talked about the economic impacts on Gen Z in terms of jobs, and particularly part-time jobs as students. A lot of Gen Z are still students. So a number of factors that are impacting that. And if we move on to the next slide, we can also see that there's been a change. If we look at 2010 versus 2020, this is the proportion in the two bubbles on the left of wine drinkers within each age group. So we see on the back in 10 years ago, 25% of wine drinkers were in the younger age group and up to 29% in 2020. But the real difference has been in the kind of the mid-year groups, and that's partly a demographic squeeze as we're moving into Gen Xers and boomers, larger generation, hence the name, are moving up. So there have been some shifts, but we must also remember that 22% of our wine drinkers in the US remain 65 and over, so in the seniors and boomers category. Okay, so if we move on to the next slide, please, Courtney. So just wrapping up, last two slides here. We have seen, so we published today, yesterday you probably will have seen it coming in, and today you'll have seen it coming into your observatories and all access wine intelligence portal, US portraits. Last updated 3 years ago, so we've had the opportunity to update that, and we have a new segment that's emerged, and it's the segment we're calling Generation Treaters. They have been drawn from two previous segments: Engaged Explorers, the younger end of Engaged Explorers, and also from a previous segment that we called kind of a Contented Treaters, Occasional Treaters. So who are Generation Treaters? And if we look at that, if we go on to the next slide, I'll talk you through a little bit about who they are. So they're typically millennials, so that means kind of 25 to 40, up to 45. So they're either pre-family or young family, typically, likely to be graduates, typically living in some of those key metropolitan areas, often working in the new economy. Their interests and drivers are around doing the right thing, so more kind of sustainably local initiative conscious, and importantly, being seen to do the right thing. Very strong in terms of expressing their personal identity, make a priority of staying both healthy and active, and making connected to this mindful and intentional purchases. So if we look at their wine behavior, we see that they are the most frequent drinkers. That's combination of on and off premise, but they are not the highest spenders. So they love wine, they're drinking it a lot, but they are happy and content with the kind of mainstream of brands in terms of pricing. They will trade up for special occasions, but they're also very happy with the mainstream brands. They're the most involved with wine. They love wine. They'll invest in going to wine tastings and going to wineries. You know, they're really involved with the category. It's important to them, but it might seem counterintuitive. They have the lowest knowledge, this breadth of knowledge level I was talking about before, wine knowledge of all segments. So you might be saying, well, that doesn't make sense, Lulu. How can you be the most involved, highest frequency, mid-range spenders, but yet the lowest knowledge? Well, the reason when we kind of go into depth and talk to these consumers is that actually, one, they're the second youngest segment, only just marginally older than social newbies. And we know that breadth of wine knowledge comes with experience, which comes with age. So the longer you've been in the category, the more your knowledge builds up. We also know that for these consumers, they're buying much more into some of the cues I was talking about earlier. Relationship with the category is much more about brand than the kind of traditional heritage of wine. And they say to us, well, I don't need to know lots about wine. Yeah, I'd kind of like to know a bit more, but it's not that important. I can buy wine. I'm comfortable buying wine. I'm confident choosing wine, but I don't necessarily need to know lots of technical details about it. So how do we engage with this segment? Social recommendations, not surprisingly, they are amongst the highest users of kind of social platforms and recommendations. They really benefit in times where it's possible with social events. So they, really high in likelihood and consideration for things like wine tasting events in stores, in bars, in restaurants. They are also interested, the segment's the most interested in kind of formal wine education or tutoring. So whether that be kind of, a wine brand or a winery running an online tasting at the moment or an in-person tasting. And, they are a generation who is, or an age group, a cohort who likes a badge, so likes a qualification, and that you can see that in their insight as well. They do definitely like distinctive labels. That doesn't mean way beyond the traditional, but it does mean distinctive, because they like, they don't have a kind of strong memory or detailed memory for remembering wine. So one of the hardest problems with generation treaters is getting noticed by them, because they'll tend to migrate, they're a little bit promiscuous, and they have along with social newbies, the other youngest segment, the lowest brand awareness. And again, that's related to their category knowledge. So that's the final trend there. So it's generation treaters. So if you look, we will be running, if we move on to the next slide, thanks, Courtney, we will be running a further workshop about going into much more detail about both generation treaters and the other segments. So we talked about consumers increasingly cautious in their lifestyles, wine being a beneficiary alongside with some of the bev-alc categories, the extension of wine out to wine o'clock, the shift towards localism known and safe, simplifying these kind of more traditions of wine and wine engagement, and millennials now taking over in the driving seat in terms of the frequency of consumption and the engagement with the wine category. So I shall finish there. We've got a couple of minutes left for questions. I'm going to let, I think Luis is going to put himself back on camera, possibly, and just talk me through or ask me some of the questions that have come up.
Yes, so we have some questions here that I didn't answer yet. Let's start with Serge Ozak. Any reason why boomers kept drinking, so during lockdown and until now? And also, what's the decisive buying factors for this group?
Thanks, Serge. So a great question. So I think in terms of why our boomers and seniors keep drinking, for them, they were the kind of first generation really in the US for whom wine was really ingrained into everyday lifestyle. So back to my really first slide at the beginning was about habits. And for them, it's kind of habitual part of socializing, sort of self-reward, making events feel more kind of special. You know, lots of us have been in the US and amongst all markets in the world have been kind of stuck at home a lot more. So and boomers and seniors, certainly we know from if you remember the reducers and halters in the segments I showed you at the beginning, actually we have typically a higher proportion of older drinkers in those segments. So they're more kind of nervous of going out. So actually, you know, making at-home occasions more enjoyable and special. Big motivators, typically there are the engaged explorer, older consumers in the engaged explorer segment, you know, the real kind of high spending enthusiasts. But typically our boomers and seniors are lower spenders. We find them in the senior sippers and kitchen casual segments. They're very confident in their knowledge and they're also confident not to spend very much. So their primary motivator often is about deal, discount, promotion, lowest price and known brand. Oh, you're saying here they never went down for the August peak. Yeah, so why didn't they go down in the August peak? I think you're asking there, Serge. I think like all consumers, because we switched from, to a certain extent, from on-premise to at-home, and then wine grew as a proportion of that at-home portfolio amongst beverage alcohol. Thanks, Luis.
Yes, and I think that Serge also means by buying decisions, he was referring to that generation treaters, not boomers.
I'm sorry. Yeah. I apologize. Sorry, I've answered the wrong question. Generation treaters, a lot of it is about kind of reassurance and confidence. Although they like wine to be distinctive, they also like it to kind of look like wine and feel a bit more special or reassuring and premium. And they rely really heavily on either friend and family recommendation or third-party endorsement. So, for example, medals, points, awards, anything that can reassure them, this is generation treaters, that they're making a good decision in terms of, but again, if you look in the portraits report, which you should now have access, there's lots of slides detailing their online behavior, how their online purchase queues, etc., etc.
Thank you. And then Rodrigo is asking, is there any cue on how these trends will impact on organic, sustainable, eco-friendly category in the US, and if millennials will push this further or not?
Yeah, again, a great question. So we're actually running in May, so you'll all be invited to it. In May, we're running a webinar specifically on solar, which is sustainable, organic, lower and no alcohol. You'll also be seeing in your observatory and all access account by mid-February, so 2 weeks time, you'll see a solar report which covers the US and also a low and no alcohol wine report at the end of February. So all that's to come. I've had a sneak preview of some of the data and not surprisingly, it's our generation treaters and our social newbies in the US who are the most open to sustainable wines, the highest percentage of considerers of organic and sustainable, but their awareness is lower than that of olders for the same reasons I was talking about earlier. So we'll go into much more detail about that on the next webinar. But overall, has sustainability solar held up during 2020? The answer is yes. So consumers haven't turned away from, US consumers have not turned away from the attitudes they had pre-pandemic.
Brilliant. And then from Michael Kirstein, for the e-commerce webinar, would you be able to take a domestic winery versus imported wine view?
Now that's a really good question. I'm going to be really mean here, Luis, and ping that back to you. Luis is the project manager for the e-commerce report. And I'm trying to remember off the top of my head when we're looking at that, if for the US, we delve into what type of DTC, whether it's domestic or not. So we'll have to come back to you on that one. But we will answer that question, and you will also see much more detail in that e-commerce report that you in March. But let us come back to you on, because I can't quite remember the question wording in that one, I'm afraid, unless you can, Luis.
We will. I think we will focus more on the communications. So online as a communications channel, but also we'll have a part as a sales channel. But I'm not quite sure. That's why I think we need to come back to this one once we are sure exactly what was the question we are asking.
We do have DTC as in purchasing. When we look at the channels, we have DTC purchasing direct from winery in person and also direct from winery website. So we do have those channels included as well.
Exactly. And then from Gabriela Coutinho, in your opinion, is the trend increasing lifestyle pessimists here to stay, or is it just a temporary consequence of the pandemic?
Yeah, I think it's clearly pandemic and therefore knock-on impacts of economic. Certainly most of the economists that I hear and listen to are talking about that, the kind of economic impacts, not really hitting us yet in many markets, and how long that impact will be. Will it be, a 2-year impact, a 3-year impact, a 10-year impact? So I think we're going to, from my understanding, that, that long tail of pessimism versus optimism will be factored by clearly the pandemic and vaccination programs, but also how that pans out in terms of economic impacts on all of us. I think we are creatures of habit, as I said at the beginning. Many of us chose to travel, to be in different places, to go out and about, to have experiences when we had a choice to. So one would say, if you were being a consumer behaviorist or an ethnographer or an anthropologist, the answer would be, we will eventually return to those activities when we feel it is safe and when we have the finances to do that. But that could be a pretty long journey to get there.
Thank you. So I'll just confirm, on the e-commerce webinar, we don't have anything particularly on domestic versus imported. We'll focus more on channel usage, channel consideration, but that's great feedback. And if it's something specific that you are looking for, please just email us so we can
have a look into how we can help.
Yeah, exactly. Then from Juan Park, thanks for the session. Many wineries might be interested about about consumption of wine in different packaging during 2020. Which, in your view, are the pack formats most benefited in 2020? I think that links into the next question, which is any on cans and which groups are they going to?
Yeah, perfect. And I know we're conscious because we've just run slightly over time and people might be logging off, but we'll keep going with the questions because this will then be on the recording. So the question was about packaging formats. Yes, again, in your All Access or Observatory, that we published a report at the end of 2020 looking at packaging. The main pack format where we saw the largest increase in consideration was in cans. And interestingly, mainly focused around generation treaters and social newbies, but also not exclusive to only those younger age groups. So that was the pack format, but we must remember that we're still coming from a really small base relatively for cans for wine, even though we can talk about big kind of net increases or net percentage increases, but those are off small bases. So we have to kind of always be cognizant of both the base, the starting point, and then that net percentage change that happens as a result of that.
Thanks. Just I answered this question, but maybe you want to add something. How wine confidence in the US compares with other top markets? is Diego Loprete asking?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So it's quite difficult sometimes to compare directly things, kind of questions about things like confidence, because there are sort of cultural factors that tend to come into it. Overall, wine drinkers in the US are amongst the more confident end, shall I say, I'll put it like that, are amongst the more confident end, yes. But again, we can add some detail into the presentation that we send out to you, and we'll just put some of those numbers in for you. Perfect. Well, I think we're coming to the end of time, aren't we there, Luis? Unless there's any other urgent questions. If there's anything unanswered, we'll come back to you directly, to the individuals that have asked those questions, and make sure that we answer those. But on that note, I will say thank you very much for attending. We really hope that this has helped bring to life some of the, we know, quite dense and long reports that we publish. And as Courtney said, when we circulate this presentation with the extra bits we've promised, we'll also add in the reference, as she said, to which slides, which reports these slides come from, to make it easier for you in the future. So thanks for attending. Thank you very much, Courtney, for organising us all, as always, and everybody, all our clients on Report Shop, and to Luis for managing the questions. And we look forward to seeing you on the next webinar. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.